obviously Klal Yisrael finds themselves now in a Tzara, and there's no bigger time in recent history that all of our tefillos are needed to ensure the safety of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. Tefillah is a very difficult endeavor to properly accomplish. It's already in the Zman HaGemara. The Gemara talks about Dvarim Sha'omdim B'rumo Shel Olam, the most important things that are in this world. B'nei Adam mizalzel bo, and people are mizalzel in it, and people are not careful with ensuring that they're probably accomplishing. Rashi says that this refers to tefillah, to davening. There's already Tosfos brings some Yerushalmi that a holy Tana gave thanks to his head that it automatically bowed by modim, which seems to indicate that kavanah, proper intent during davening, is extremely, extremely difficult. If he's thinking his head that it automatically fell into line and bowed by modim, it means his awareness level during the tefillah was not that high. So it's definitely something that's extremely difficult. It's something that's a lifelong struggle, and it's something that every one of us have to work on throughout our lifetime to increase our kavanah and tefillah. What we're going to try to discuss today is what is the minimum requirement of kavanah to ensure that at least you fulfilled your obligation of tefillah. Now, when we speak in terms of one's obligation of tefillah, we're referring to Shemona Esrei. When there's tefillah, the word tefillah is used, it typically refers to Shemona Esrei. Whether or not there's an obligation to daven Minat Torah each day, what's included in that Minat Torah obligation, whether or not tefillah is d'Rabbanan, that's not something we're going to discuss. But at the end of the day, everyone agrees that there's an absolute obligation to daven Shemona Esrei at least 3 times a day. So in terms of being Yotzei Shemona Esrei, what is the requirement of kavanah? Where is that kavanah required? Is what we're going to hopefully accomplish today. I once saw a comment from Rav David Krongas from Eretz Yisrael, and he said something that is very resonated very much. He says that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's a time that we all focus in more on our tefillah. And he says the natural human tendency is to focus on the parts of davening that speak to them. If you need something specific, you're going to zero in at that time, at that bracha. If you're focusing on the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're going to focus by the Rosh Hashanah Amidah on the Malchios. He says a person should realize that that's all beautiful and wonderful, and throughout the day of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the parts that resonate with you are, if you want to extend it, if someone has someone that they're davening for who's a cholo, that's close to them, so they could space out for parts of Shemona Esrei, but when it gets to the bracha of Rifa'enu, when they're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to provide a cure, they're going to zero in and they're going to focus in on their bracha to ensure that they have proper kavanah. However, he says, you should realize that if you skipped over kavanah in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, in the bracha of Avos, which signs off Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avram, you're not Yotzei Shemona Esrei. And in fact, not only you're not Yotzei Shemona Esrei, we're going to see that there's a real tzad in halacha that all the brachos that you said there after the not having proper kavanah in the first bracha are brachos levatol, are brachos that were said in vain. So he says that a person should ensure that their primary focus at all those times that he's inspired and moved to have kavanah in a specific bracha, at least make sure you first have kavanah in the first bracha Shemona Esrei, that your Shemona Esrei could qualify as a Shemona Esrei, and in that context, you could then have a more sincere, heartfelt kavanah in a specific bracha that speaks to you. So we're going to explore that idea that kavanah in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei is absolutely essential for one's fulfillment of Shemona Esrei, and we'll discuss what type of kavanah is required. So there's basically three different gemaras and brachas that are the main primary gemaras that deal with this issue. So let's go through them one by one. So there are going to be 2 parts. One part is we're going to have more of a share, then towards the end I'll come back to this world and tell you the halacha l'maisa, how the Mishnah Berurah views kavanah. So there's 3 gemaras and brachas. The first gemara brachas is the gemara in Laman and Beis. The background of the gemara is not so important to our discussion, but essentially there's a three-way machlokas tanan as to whether or not there's a chiyuv to daven musaf on a yachid, on an individual? Is musaf only on a minyan? Is musaf only on a person that's within a minyan, or is musaf on an individual alone? So the Gemara was discussing how we paskin. So Rabbi Yochanan, which is number 1 on the sheet, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Ani re'isi es Rabbi Yanai, I saw Rabbi Yanai, tzali v'hader tzali. He davened, and then he davened again. If you take a look at this Gemara in the Yerushalmi, the Gemara in the Yerushalmi gives some more details to the story. It says there was a Maisa Haya b'shuk shel Tzipori. It was a story in the marketplace of Tzipori that Rabbi Yochanan saw that Rabbi Yanai was davening, obviously as an individual, and then he walked 4 amos, which doesn't take so long to do, and then he davened again. So Rabbi Yochanan said, from the fact that he did that, it must be, why you daven Shemona Esrei and then daven Shemona Esrei again? It must be you were doing Shachar and Musaf. And therefore bringing a proof that even an individual would daven Musaf. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera, what is Rabbi Yochanan's proof? The fact that Rabbi Yanai davened the second Shemona Esrei, how do you know that was Musaf? Says Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera, maybe Dilma me kar lo kivein daite. Maybe in the first Shemona Esrei he didn't have proper kavanah. Well, himself kivein daite. He davened the second time, and in the second Shemona Esrei he had kavanah. So they're challenging the eidos of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan saying, I saw Rabbi Yanai daven the second Shemona Esrei right after his first one. It must be he was Musaf. Says Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera, no. Maybe in the first Shemona Esrei, Rabbi Yanai did not have kavanah, and therefore he davened a second time. So the Gemara responds that that's not an option. Amar lei chazi man gaver rabba to kamasan alai. Don't you see? You should know who's this person that gave the eidos. He's a tremendous person. Rabbi Yochanan gave the eidos, gave the testimony about Rabbi Yanai. You could rest assured. This is the way Rashi explains the Gemara. You could rest assured that Rabbi Yochanan knew what he was talking about. Rabbi Yochanan knew what he was looking at. He saw Rabbi Yanai daven the second Shemona Esrei. He never would have given the testimony that the second Shemona Esrei was Musaf unless he for sure knew that it was Musaf. Maybe he figured it out from the length of the Shemona Esrei, however he figured it out. But the Gemara is objecting to that possibility that maybe Rabbi Yochanan reported wrong on what he saw. So the Gemara clearly is stating that if indeed Rabbi Yanai did not have kavanah in his first Shemona Esrei, then he would have repeated a second Shemona Esrei in order to fulfill the chiyuv of Shemona Esrei. The Gemara does not qualify what is considered kavanah and where he was lacking kavanah. Those 2 variables are not clear whatsoever from this Gemara. All the Gemara says is that perhaps Rabbi Yanai did not have kavanah. What type of kavanah and where is he lacking kavanah, the Gemara doesn't comment on. The next Gemara happens to be on the same Amud, Laman Amud Beis. The Gemara records an incident of Rechia bar Abba, Tzali v'Hadar Tzali. Rechia bar Abba davened, and boom, back to back he davened another Shemona Esrei. So now Reb Zera is trying to analyze why is it that Rechia bar Abba, right after davening the Shemona Esrei, davened the second Shemona Esrei. So Amar Reb Zera, my time of Mar Hachi. Why did he do this? So says Reb Zera, Ilema, if you're going to suggest the reason for Rechia bar Abba's second Shemona Esrei is Mishum de lo kivein mar daite. It's because in the first Shemona Esrei he was lacking kavanah. He was lacking kavanah, and therefore he davened a second Shemona Esrei. Says Reb Zera, this cannot be. Why? Rabbi Eliezer says, the olam yimon odom es atzmo v'yochel lechave es libo yispalo v'mava yispalo. A person before davening needs to check himself to see if when he begins the tefillah he'll be able to do so with kavanah. If a person realizes that he's not in a frame of mind, he's not in a state of being that he can have proper intent, he's not allowed to daven. He should not daven. He cannot daven. So Reb Zera is saying there's no way that Rechia bar Abba davened the second Shemona Esrei because he was missing kavanah in his first Shemona Esrei, because we could assume that Rechia bar Abba knows this dictum of Rabbi Eliezer, and he would not have davened unless he was in the proper frame of mind. So if Rechia bar Abba started off the tefillah in the proper frame of mind, he probably had kavanah. And therefore, Reb Zera rejects the possibility for Reb Chia bar Abba's second Shemona Esrei to be because of a lack of kavanah in the first Shemona Esrei.
Rabbi Harris?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought. That everybody's level of kavanah is different. I mean, obviously.
Right. So we're gonna get to what is considered kavanah later, but the suggestion that Reb Chia bar Abba repeated the Shemona Esrei because he missed kavanah in the first Shemona Esrei would be a kavanah on the level that you would have to repeat because of, which we'll define later. Reb Zera rejects that possibility because you have to check yourself to make sure that you can daven appropriately before you daven. If you cannot daven, then you're not allowed to daven. So the Gemara therefore says that it must be the reason why Reb Chia bar Abba repeated Shemona Esrei was due to the fact that he missed Yalav Yovo in the first Shemona Esrei and he was Rosh Chodesh, and the Gemara goes on with the whole discussion regarding that. But be it as it may, it's clear from this Gemara that Reb Zera objects to the possibility of someone on the stature of Reb Chia bar Abba to have davened the Shemona Esrei unless he was in the frame of mind to daven so appropriately with kavanah. The Marsha raises an obvious contradiction between these two Gemaras. Let's go back to Gemara number 1. Gemara number 1 was Rabbi Yochanan testifying about Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai davened the second Shemona Esrei. Rabbi Yochanan suggested that second Shemona Esrei was Muslim. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to who? And this is very important to keep track of the name. To Reb Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Reb Zera, maybe the reason for Rabbi Yanai's second Shemona Esrei was because he lacked kavanah in the first Shemona Esrei. A couple lines down in the Gemara, Reb Zera says that's not an option for Reb Chia bar Abba. You cannot say Reb Chia bar Abba davened the second Shemona Esrei because he lacked kavanah in his first Shemona Esrei, because there's a halacha that you have to first make sure you're in the proper frame of mind before you daven. And Reb Chia bar Abba surely did that, and he surely had kavanah. So why in the previous Gemara, says the Marsha, asks the Marsha, why in that Gemara did Reb Zera not throw that possibility out the window? He should have said, you want to tell me Rabbi Yanai davened the second Shemona Esrei because he was lacking kavanah in his first Shemona Esrei? Cannot be. Obviously, Rabbi Yanai checked himself before he davened to ensure that he could do so with proper kavanah, and therefore the possibility should have been rejected. It's only when it comes to Reb Chia bar Abba does Reb Zera reject the possibility based on Reb Eliezer. But by Reb Yanai, Reb Zera did not do so. So the Marsha says, B'dochek, that you have to answer this contradiction in the Gemara, that in the previous Gemara, when it came to Reb Yanai, Reb Zera was not yet aware of the halacha of Reb Eliezer, that a person must first check himself before davening to ensure that he has kavanah. Seems like somewhat of a dochek answer, so we're going to try to explore if we can come up with another answer to this contradiction in the Gemara. The third and final Gemara, which is perhaps the most important Gemara when discussing kavanah and Shemona Esrei, is the Gemara in Brachos on Lamed Daled Lamed Beis. So the Gemara in Brachos on Lamed Daled Lamed Beis says, "Ike demasna braysa hamispalo." One who davens, tzarich sheyechavin es libo b'kulam. He must have kavanah in all of the brachos of Shemona Esrei. You need to have kavanah in all of the brachos of Shemona Esrei. Ve'im eino yachol l'chavin b'kulam. If one is unable to have kavanah in all of the brachos, yechavin es libo b'achas. He should have kavanah in one of the brachos. Amar Rav Chia, Amar Rav Safra, mishum chad de'beirav be'avos. What is the bracha that is absolutely essential and required? The bracha of avos, the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So this Gemara in Brachos and Lamed Daled Lamed Beis is at least answering one of our questions. What is the minimum requirement for where you have to have kavanah in Shemona Esrei? The Gemara says in avos. Now again, the Gemara does not qualify what is considered kavanah. That's a separate discussion, not discussed in the Gemara. But the Gemara is saying, where is whatever kavanah is considered, where is it required? It's at minimum required in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So these are the three Gemaras that essentially deal with kavanah. Tosos on Lamed Daled Lamed Beis raises what seems to be a contradiction between the Gemara on Lamed Amud Beis and the Gemara on Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Why is that? Because go back to the Gemara with Rabbi bar Abba, where the suggestion was that maybe Rabbi bar Abba davened the second Shemona Esrei because his lack of kavanah in his first Shemona Esrei. Reb Zera says, no way. You have to all the mimun adam es atzmo yachal hispalo. Says Tosos, that Gemara implies that you require kavanah in the entire Shemona Esrei. The Gemara there doesn't limit kavanah to just the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, just to avos. The Gemara's mashma, le'olam yimun adam es atzmo yachal hispalo, and yachal lechavin es libo yispalo, which implies the entire Shemona Esrei. So in a certain sense, there's a contradiction in Gemaras. The Gemara in Lamed Amud Beis seems to indicate that kavanah is necessary for the entire duration of Shemona Esrei, from bracha 1 through bracha 19, through bracha 18. The Gemara in Lamed Amud Beis is super clear that kavanah is only required in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So what is it? Is it the entire Shemona Esrei, or is it just the first bracha of Shemona Esrei? So this is the question that bothers Tosos. Tosos answers the last line in Tosos, Yesh lefaresh, you could explain, Hasam nami ba'achas mehen. Even though the Gemara does not say so, even though it's not mashma in the Gemara, you could say that the halacha of Lamed Amud Beis, of the Olam Yimun Adam Es Atzmo, is also only for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So Tosos is reconciling the apparent contradiction between the two Gemaras by limiting the second Gemara on Lamed Amud Beis to a person needs to check himself to ensure that he could have kavanah where? Not the entire Shemona Esrei, only the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So it comes out according to Shitas Tosos that the requirement for kavanah in order to be Yotzei Shemona Esrei is only in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. Now, from where do we know that kavanah is ma'akev? Ma'akev means, where do we know that a person doesn't discharge his obligation of davening without proper kavanah in at least the first bracha of avos? So there's only one Gemara that all the Rishonim bring to indicate that. And that's the first Gemara that we learned together. The Gemara says that maybe Rabbi Yanai davened a second time because of his lack of kavanah. Says the Rosh, which is on number 6, the Rosh says, from the fact that the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Yanai davened the second time because his first time he was lacking kavanah, that shows us that kavanah is not just an extra credit, it's not just a plus, it's a ma'akev. You are not Yotzei Shemona Esrei without the kavanah, which would explain why he davened the second time. Which means, the Gemara in Lamed Amud Beis, which says that a person needs to have kavanah in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, if it was just for that Gemara, you could technically learn that Gemara. Needs, it's a plus, it's an addition, it's extra credit. Where do we know in halacha, and this is all the Rishonim, all the Nosei Kelim, this the source they bring for the halacha, that Shemona Esrei's requirement of kavanah is ma'akev, is from the fact that the Gemara suggests that's why Rabbi Yanai said a second Shemona Esrei. So obviously, because the first one he didn't have kavanah is ma'akev, you're not yotzei, you don't fulfill your obligation, and therefore he repeated Shemona Esrei. So let's take a look now at the Rambam and see if the Rambam learned these Gemaras in the same fashion as we just explained. So there's essentially the Rambam in Perek Dalet in Hilchos Tefillah, and then the Rambam in Perek Yud in Hilchos Tefillah. So the very first Rambam in Perek Dalet Halacha Aleph, the Rambam says there are chamisha, it's number 7, there are chamisha dvarim that are ma'akven es hatefillah. There are 5 things that are ma'akev, that are absolutely essential for a person to discharge his obligation of davening. And for our purpose, the main one is the last one that he mentions, which is kavanas halev. So the 5th requirement for a person Shemona Esrei to be Shemona Esrei is kavanas halev, is intent. Says the Rambam in Halacha 16, Halacha Tezvav, Halacha 15, kavanas halev ketzad. What is considered kavanas halev? Kol tefillah she'ena b'kavana, eino tefillah. Any tefillah that is said without kavanah is not a tefillah. It's pretty harsh terminology. It's not a tefillah. Tefillah below kavanah is not a tefillah. Vim hispalo below kavanah, the Rambam says if one davens without kavanah, choser umispalo bi kavanah. He must go back and daven with kavanah. Says the Rambam, if a person finds himself all over the place, with libo torah, and his heart is pulling him in many directions, he's thinking about stuff. Asr lo lehispalo, he's not allowed to daven until he's able to calm himself down. So the Rambam is clear that tefillah without kavanah is not tefillah. He's clear that if you davened without kavanah, you must go back and daven a second time. The Rambam's clear, the halacha of Rabbi Eliezer that Rav Zera brought in the second Gemara in Brachos, that if a person is not in a frame of mind to be able to daven, he cannot daven. Then in halacha Tazayin, the Rambam defines what is considered kavanah. Right? Up until now, we've been only discussing where is kavanah required and whether or not kavanah is ma'akid. In halacha Tazayin, the Rambam defines for us what is kavanah. Says the Rambam, Ketzad hiya kavanah, sheyafana es libo mikol ha'machshavos. Person should free his heart from all thoughts. V'yira atzmo, and he should see himself Ke'ilu hu omed lifnei hashchina, as if he is standing in front of the Shechina. So the Rambam defines the requirement of kavanah is an awareness that when you're davening Shemona Esrei, you're omed lifnei hamelech. You're standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So kavanah is not peush hamilim. It's not the understanding of the words that you're saying, which we'll see is a different opinion. The Rambam is crystal clear that the kavanah he's referring to over here is an awareness that when you're standing up to daven Shemona Esrei, you're putting your 2 feet together, you're standing in front of the Melech Malchei Hamlachim. And that's the requirement of kavanah. Now, if you noticed, the Rambam in Perek Daled does not say where kavanah is required. He tells us what the kavanah is, Omin Lifnei HaMelech. He tells us that a tefillah without kavanah is not a tefillah. He tells us that if a person davened without kavanah, meaning he realized he was Omin Lifnei HaMelech, you have to daven again. He told us it's usher to daven. If a person's not in a frame of mind, then when he stands up to pray, he doesn't realize he's Omin Lifnei HaMelech. The Rambam does not tell us where this requirement is. Is it the first bracha of Shemona Esrei? Is it the entire Shemona Esrei? The Rambam does not comment on that. A very serious omission. However, if you take a look at Perek Yud in the Rambam, 6 prakim later, the Rambam says, Misha hispalo v'lo chivin es libo. If someone davens and he did not have kavanah, yachzer v'yispalo b'kavanah. He should go back and daven with kavanah. V'im kivin es libo b'bracha rishona. However, if he had kavanah in the first bracha, in the bracha of Avos, shuv eino tzarech, then he no longer needs to go back and daven. So here in Perek Yud, the Rambam is qualifying, like the Gemara in Lamed Dalet and Beis in Brachos, that the requirement of kavanah is only in the bracha rishon. So it's very strange, and this is the ha'ara of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the second piece Rav Chaim has in his writing on the Rambam, and it's the first 2 dinim that appear in Chiddushei Rav Chaim HaLevi. So Rav Chaim says that when you learn through Perek Daled, the lack of the Rambam qualifying where the kavanah is required and limiting kavanah to be applicable only to the first bracha of Avos, that admission is not by chance. It's on purpose. The Rambam in Perek Daled holds that kavanah is required in the entire Shemona Esrei. The Rambam in Perek Yud says kavanah is required only in the bracha and Avos. Now obviously that's a contradiction within the Rambam. Because if you learn through the Rambam in Perek Daled, the fact that he doesn't qualify that this kavanah is limited to the bracha of Avos is in and of itself an indication that the kavanah requirement is in the entirety of the Shemona Esrei. Perek Yud, the Rambam is like the Gemara in Lamed Aleph Beis, and limits the kavanah to avos. So what is going on over here? That's one question that Rav Chaim raises. So Rav Chaim, in order to explain these Rambams, Rav Chaim comes up with two dinim in kavanah. There are two types of kavanah that are required for one to be yotzei, one to fulfill his obligation when davening Shemona Esrei. Now, one type of kavanah, the Rambam in Halacha Tes Zayin and Perek Dalet told us, the kavanah of Omid Difnei Hamelach. When a person stands up to daven Shemona Esrei, he must be aware of the fact that he's standing in front of the Melech Malchei Hamlach. Rav Chaim says the other requirement of kavanah is kavanah in the Pirush Hamilah. A person has to understand that which he's saying. To know the translation, the basic meaning, the basic translation of the Shemona Esrei. So those are two different types of kavanah. Kavanah of Omid Difnei Hamelach and a kavanah of Pirush Hamilah. So now that Rav Chaim created two different types of kavanah, Rav Chaim suggests that the Rambam in Perek Dalet, which implies that kavanah is required throughout the entirety of the Shemona Esrei, there the Rambam is referring to, as he says in Halacha Tes Zayin, that's the kavanah of Omid Difnei Hamelach. For the entire time that a person is engaged in his prayer of Shemona Esrei, he has to be aware and cognizant of the fact that he's Omid Difnei Hamelach. That kavanah is ma'akiv in kol hatfilah. The Rambam in Perek Yud, which limits the requirement of kavanah to the bracha of avos, that kavanah the Rambam is talking about is only kavanah and Pirush Hamilah. So for a person to be yotzei Shemona Esrei, according to the way Rav Chaim understands the Rambam, throughout the entire Shemona Esrei, Perek Dalet taught us, you need awareness that you're Omid Difnei Hamelach. Perek Yud teaches us that at minimum, kavanah of Pirush Hamilah, understanding the basic meaning and translation of the words, is required for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei.
Where did Rav Chaim see in the Rambam Pirush Hamilah?
So the Rambam doesn't say in Perek Yud what the kavanah is, but it's clear that there's a contradiction. He limits kavanah to avos, and there he says in Perek Dalet that the lack of applying it just to avos indicates that it's an entire Shemona Esrei. So you have to create two dinim. Now, the truth is that if you take a look at the Lashonos in Perek Dalet, the Rambam says that tefillah below kavanah is not a tefillah. In Perek Yud, he doesn't say that. He says it's ma'akev the tefillah. He doesn't come out all harsh and say a tefillah without kavanah is not a tefillah. And the way Rav Chaim explains the distinction is as follows. Rav Chaim says, why is it that the kavanah, that you're Omid Difnei Hamelach, is a requirement in the entirety of the tefillah? Rav Chaim says, because if a person, what is tefillah? Tefillah is you're beseeching the Almighty. If you're not aware that you're davening to Hashem, then you're not engaged in tefillah. He says it's like misasek. You're not involved in an act of prayer if you're not focused on to whom you're praying to. So Rav Chaim says it makes a lot of sense that the kavanah of Omid Difnei Hamelach would be a requirement in the entire Shemona Esrei. Because without that awareness, you're not even engaged in an act of davening.
Why is it limited to just Shemona Esrei? I know that's tefillah.
That is tefillah.
To have kavanah for brachos, for pesukah
Right,
zemra,
okay,
for
so-
Shema.
Yeah, okay, so Shema, the first pasuk, the Kriya Shema, and the first bracha of Avos have a tremendous amount of similarities in halacha. But other than that, that's the essential tefillah that we talk about in terms of discharging one's obligation. It's suggested to have kavanah everywhere, but we're very limited to where. So let's focus on the basic requirement to at least be yotzei. Yeah.
I could see Pirush Hamilah with all the Sidorim that are interlinear or whatnot. You can cop that. With knowing with the king and all that with
Right.
Hashem, it may not be so easy. So how do you bring yourself to that sort of level it should be like it says on the should be
Right.
Hashem l'negatame.
It's an excellent question.
That's not
but-
it may be out of the scope of this year.
Yeah, it's an excellent question that we'll maybe discuss at a different time. That's an excellent question. So in terms of going back to the Rambam, so Rav Chaim explains that since the kavanah of Omid Lifnei HaMelech is what turns your tefillah into a tefillah, because obviously who else are you beseeching, that therefore is required in the entirety of the Shemona Esrei. Perush Hamilim, as long as you were Omid Lifnei HaMelech, your tefillah is a tefillah. There's a din that's specific to Shemona Esrei that you have to know the explanation of the words. So that's limited only to the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So that's how Rav Chaim understands what comes out from the Rambam.
Your Shemona Esrei doesn't count if you're lacking in either of them?
Yes. Now, I wouldn't use the word don't count. I would say if you're lacking Omid Lifnei HaMelech, it's Kilu Yidin Daven. If you're lacking Kavanah Perush Hamilim, then you weren't Yotzei Shemona Esrei. We'll expand on that shortly. Now, let's just go back to the Gemaras. So Rav Chaim came up with this brilliant two dinim, a beautiful, brilliant explanation in the Rambam, which, by the way, created a tremendous uproar. Rav Shach and Abi Ezri goes wild against this Rav Chaim. Chazon Ish goes to town against this Rav Chaim. But be it as it may, let's learn the sugya according to Rav Chaim. So let's go back to the Gemaras. So the Gemara in Brachos, we have three Gemaras. So to me, it's simple. If you take a look at Tosos, when Tosos learned the Gemara in Lamed Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara in Lamed Daled Amud Beis told us that Kavanah is limited to the first bracha of Avos. Tosos asked the contradiction. The Gemara with Reb Chia bar Abba, with Reb Zera, with Reb Eliezer seem to hold that Kavanah is required in all of Shemona Esrei. So Tosos says the contradiction in Gemaras. Tosos said Yesh Lefarish that even Reb Chia bar Abba, even Reb Zera, Reb Eliezer, that's just the bracha of Avos. According to Reb Chaim, according to Reb Chaim's Rambam, and this is for sure where the Rambam is coming from. The Rambam was bothered by this exact contradiction of the Gemara that Tosos asks. And the Rambam says there's no contradiction. The Gemara that says that Gemara is referring to Kavanah of Omid Lifnei HaMelech. And therefore, if you can't have that Kavanah, it's not a tefillah. So of course you shouldn't daven. And that's what that Gemara assumes that Kavanah is required in the entire Shemona Esrei. The Gemara in Lamed Daled Amud Beis, which limits the Kavanah to just be to the Birchas Avos, because that's talking about Kavanah and Perush Hamilim. That's talking about an understanding of the words that you're saying. And that indeed is only the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So this is the basis of the Rambam. The basis of the Rambam to know that there are two dinim in Kavanah, and to know that the Kavanah of Omid Lifnei HaMelech is required throughout the entire Shemona Esrei. And the limitation of Perush Hamilim to the bracha of Avos is because the Rambam was bothered by this exact contradiction of Tosos. And instead of answering the contradiction like Tosos did, that the Gemara in Lamed Amud Beis is limited also as well to Avos, which is not the mashmos of the Gemara, the Rambam says they're talking about two different kavanahs. Lamed Amud Beis is talking about the kavanah of Omid Lifnei HaMelech, which actually is Na'akev and Kol HaTfilah, and Lamed Daled Amud Beis is talking about kavanah and Perush Hamilim, which is limited to the bracha of Avos, and therefore there is no contradiction in the Gemara. Furthermore, Rav Chaim, and then we'll go back to the Rambam and then go back to the Gemara. Rav Chaim makes an unbelievable further point. Says Rav Chaim, now that you understand the context of Perek Daled and Perek Yud in the Rambam. Perek Daled in the Rambam is talking about Kavanah of Omid Lifnei HaMelech. Perek Yud in the Rambam is talking about intent with understanding the words, and is limited to Avos. Rav Chaim says, look at the differences between Perek Daled and Perek Yud. Perek Daled says that it's usher for someone to daven if he is not in the frame of mind to do so. Perek Yud doesn't say that. Perek Yud says, if you didn't have kavanah, go back and daven again. Never once does the Rambam in Perek Yud say that it's usher for someone to daven if he's not in the frame of mind to do so. It's not stated. So Rav Chaim says, you see from here, that in truth, the halacha of Rabbi Eliezer that says the Yomam Yimod Adam Es Atzmo Yochel Echavein Eslibo Yispalu V'Lava Yispalu, that's only referring to the kavanah of Omid Lefnei HaMelech. So if a person is in a frame of mind that they could be cognizant of the fact that they're standing in front of the King of Kings, even if he's not able to have kavanah in the Perush HaMilim, Rav Chaim holds, go ahead and daven. No problem. And that's why in Perek Yud, where the Rambam is only referring to kavanah of Perush HaMilim, there's no mention of this halacha of Rabbi Eliezer, of the Olam Yimon Adam Es Atzmo, because it's not true. A tefillah that's said with the awareness of Omen Lefnei HaMelech, even when it's lacking kavanah of Perush HaMilim, is still a tefillah. You're not going to be yotzei a tefillah b'kavanah, but it's still a tefillah. And that's the beautiful lashon of the Rambam. In Perek Daled, the Rambam says a tefillah without kavanah is not a tefillah. In Perek Yud, the Rambam doesn't say anything about a tefillah below kavanah not being a tefillah. He says you've got to go back and daven, but it still qualifies as a tefillah. Because as long as a person is engaged in heartfelt prayer, there's a beautiful mabit in Sefer, in mabit writes that we're saying Shema Kolenu. He says it's a very interesting usage of word. Kolenu, listen to our voice. So mabit says it means what it's saying. Because we're asking Hashem, even if we weren't tuned in, even if we didn't have kavanah, we said the words, at least listen to our voice. A tefillah without kavanah, without Perush HaMilim, is still kolenu, it's still our voice. It still has a tremendous impact. These Anshe Knesset Hagadolah put together the Tefillah Shemona Esrei. Each word contains thousands and thousands of missiles in it that have far greater power than we could ever even scratch the surface of its meaning. The mere uttering of the words, in and of itself, is strong enough for us to beseech Hashem, Shema Kolenu. Because a tefillah lacking kavanah of Perush HaMilim is still a tefillah. The Rambam only calls a tefillah without kavanah not a tefillah. Only tells us it's usher to daven. If a person cannot daven, he's not in the frame of mind to do so, only in regards to Omed Lefnei HaMelech. In regards to Perush HaMilim, says the Rabbi Chaim, the Rambam is clear. It's a tefillah. You weren't yotzei tefillah b'kavanah. Okay, you weren't yotzei tefillah b'kavanah that the Rabbanan requires, so you got to go back and daven. But you can't tell me that it wasn't a tefillah. We're going to revisit this sort of Rabbi Chaim soon. So now let's go back to the Gemara. So now the Gemara is, according to the Rambam, are looking perfect. You have the Gemara Lamed Aleph Beis that tells us Kavanas Ma'akev and Avos. That Gemara is talking about Perush HaMilim. You have the Gemara on Lamed Aleph Beis that says that a person not allowed to daven if he's not in the frame of mind to do so, which implies, as Tosas himself agrees, referring to the whole davening. Perfect. That was Kavanah in Omed Lefnei HaMelech. Let's go back to the first Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan saw Rabbi Yanai daven and then daven again. Rabbi Yochanan wanted to bring a proof that from the fact that Rabbi Yanai davened the second time, it must be he was davening Musaf, and you see even an individual could daven Musaf. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zera, who says maybe the first time around he didn't have kavanah, and the second time around he did. The Gemara rejects that because Chaziman Gavra with the Kamasan Alai, what Rashi understands. Rabbi Yochanan's giving Eidos, you can trust him that he saw what he saw and he knows what he saw. The problem was, the Marsha says, that Reb Zera is inconsistent. Reb Zera in the second Gemara rejects the possibility of Reb Chia bar Abba's second Shemona Esrei being due to a lack of kavanah. So why in the first Gemara didn't Reb Zera jump in and say, you can't say Reb Yanai davened the second time because of a lack of kavanah. There's a requirement of L'olam Yimod Adam Es Atzmo. Marshal, the Dochik, said that maybe Reb Zera did not yet know that idea of Reb Eliezer. So perhaps, based on this Reb Chaim, we could offer a different answer to the contradiction. In the first Gemara, the Gemara says two words that don't appear in the second Gemara. Ani re'isi. Yochanan says, I saw. The second Gemara, the Gemara reported a fact. Rav Chia bar Abba was Tzali v'Hadar Tzali. First Gemara is very clear. Ani re'isi, I saw. The Yerushalmi even gives more background. Rabbi Yochanan was in the Shuk Shel Tzipori, Rabbi Yanai was there, Rabbi Yanai davened, he walked 4 amos, then he davened again. In the first Gemara, if you think about it, it's very clear, if you're watching someone daven, especially Rabbi Yochanan, it's very clear to know whether or not the person was spaced in or not, right? So Rabbi Yochanan sitting there watching Rabbi Yanai get up to daven, you could pretty much be rest assured that Rabbi Yochanan could tell if Rabbi Yanai had the awareness of the Fnei HaMelech. You could see the state of what he's in. You could see the way in which he's approaching his tefillah. So the Gemara knows that there was no possibility of the suggestion that Rabbi Yanai redaven to be due to the lack of kavanah of the Fnei HaMelech. Ani re'isi, I saw. The only possibility that the Gemara is referring to is, look, I don't know what's going through the person's mind when he's reading the words. Is he focused on the translation of the words? Is he focused on the meaning of the words? That part, the Gemara says, maybe that was the kavanah that Rabbi Yanai was lacking. So what do you want the Reb Zera to say? There's a halacha l'olam yimur the masatzma? It's not true. There is no such halacha. It came out according to the Rambam. The only time that a person cannot daven, if he's not in the frame of mind to do so, is only if he's not in the frame of mind of Omid Lifnei HaMelech. But if he's lacking the ability to have kavanah and perush hamilim, you're allowed to daven. As the Rav Chaim was medayik in Perek Yud, the Rambam does not quote the concept of Asur Le'espalo. So therefore, the Gemaras are beautiful. When Rabbi Yochanan saw that Rabbi Yanai davened again, obviously Rabbi Yochanan knew what he saw. He was able to see that Rabbi Yanai was in a state of mind, in a frame of mind, to be focused on the Fnei HaMelech. The only suggestion that Rabbi Yanai had to Reb Zera is that maybe Rabbi Yanai was lacking the kavanah of Perush Hamilah. Okay, that I can't see. I can't see what the person's focused on as he's saying the words. You know what the Gemara responds? Chazi man gaber rabba t'chamasad alai. Rashi learned, don't worry, Rabbi Yochanan knows what he's talking about. You know how the Rambam learns? The Rambam learns Chazi man gaber rabba t'chamasad alai. Who are you talking about over here? You're talking about Rabbi Yanai. You're going to be choshesh that Rabbi Yanai was omid l'fnei HaMelech, had awareness that he's dal l'fnei miyat omid, but he lacked the kavanah of perush hamilim? You cannot say that about a Gavar Rabba on Rabbi Yanai's statue. And therefore, the Gemara rejects the possibility of Rabbi Yanai's second Shemon Esrei to be due to a lack of kavanah. It was never possible to be due to a lack of Amin Lefnei HaMelech. That's why Reb Zera didn't object with the halacha of Rabbi Eliezer. The only possibility was a lack of kavanah and perush hamilah. Says the Gemara, different than Rashi's way of understanding. Chazi man Gavar Rabba t'chamasad alai. You're talking about Rabbi Yanai here. If you're talking about Rabbi Yanai here, come on, he's only the Fnei HaMelech and he missed kavanah perush hamilim. Says the Gemara, that cannot be. And that's why when we move over to the later Gemara, where Rabbi Chia bar Abba davened and then he davened again, and then Reb Zera says, why did he do that? If it's because he didn't have kavanah, of course Reb Zera didn't dare suggest that the kavanah that was missing was perush hamilim. Because he was already shown, Chazi man gavar rabba t'chamasad alai. Chia bar Abba is no slouch. He also had kavanah. The only possibility is maybe you didn't have the awareness of Amin Lefnei HaMelech. To that the Gemara says, V'olam imen od mesatzim yochel yispalo, v'im lav al yispalo. So this is clear how the Rambam learns through the Gemaras, and it provides where the Rambam's coming from is the contradiction between Lamed Dalet and Beis and Lamed and Beis, and l'chor the Rambam's also coming from the stira that the Marsha raises between the two Gemaras and Lamed and Beis. So it comes out, according to Rav Chaim, that there's two dinim in kavanah. Kavanah is required of Omin Lefnei HaMelech throughout the entire duration of Shemon Esrei, and kavanah of perush hamilim is required in the first bracha of Shemon Esrei. So now let's move over just to end with some practical halacha. The practical halacha is on the, which page is this? The practical halacha is on page Tazayin. Where is it? Page 12 on the bottom. So the Mechaber in Siman Tzaddik Ches Sif Aleph, the Mechaber says, "Hamispalel tzar sheyachavin b'libo perish hamilos shemoti b'svasa." One who davens Shemona Esrei needs to be mechaven the understanding of the words that come out of his mouth. Then he adds, "V'yachshav ki'ilu shchina kenegdo," and he should think about the shchina being kenegdo, which is essentially Omed Lifnei HaMelech. The Mechaber in Tzaddik Ches does not qualify where such kavanah is required. If you go to the Mechaber in Kaf Aleph, the Mechaber says, number 14, "Hamispal tzorach sheyachavin b'chol habrachos." One who davens has to have kavanah on all the brachos. V'im eino yochel yachavin b'kulam, the pachos at least yachavin b'avos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Sifkat and Beis, number 15, Sheyachavin, Hainu Pirush Hamilos. So the Mishnah Berurah is very clear, not simple at all to know where the Mishnah Berurah is coming from, but it's irrelevant if we don't know where. This is what he says. The Mishnah Berurah is very, very clear that the only kavanah that's required, and that's absolutely essential for one Shemona Esrei to be a good Shemona Esrei, is kavanah in Perush Hamilim in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. Akain, therefore, ma nachum me'od, how appropriate is the hamonim, to the masses, shall yimudu Perush Hamilos, shall kol hatfilah, they shall learn the explanation of the words of all of Davening, v'al kol panim shall berachas avos, at least the bracha of avos, umodim, and modim, which is a whole separate shir, where modim got into the picture. Bevada yesh chiyav alav leyeda bi'uro is for sure an obligation for a person to know its explanation. So the Mishnah Berurah is paskening that the kavanah that's required is just kavanah perush hamilim. What happened to the line in the Mechaber of you should know that you're Omed Lifnei HaMelech? But the Mishnah Berurah drops that and says that the kavanah that's required is perush hamilim, and it's only in the first bracha of Avos. Then go back to the Mechaber number 14. Mechaber says, "Im lo chivim b'avos." If you do not have kavanah in Avos, afa pisha kivim b'chol hashar, even though you had kavanah in the rest, yachzer v'yispalo. Go back and daven. That's what the Gemara said. There's an important caveat. The Ramah says, "V'ha'idna." Nowadays, ein chozrin b'shvil chesaron kavanah. We do not go back because of a lack of kavanah. Why? Sha'af b'chazara, because even when we repeat, karav hu shelo yachavin, in all probability, the same way you didn't have kavanah the first time around, you would not have kavanah the second time around. Im kain lama yachsa. This is all back. This goes back all the way to the time of the Torah. This halach is from the Torah. That yes, it's true that if you lacked kavanah perush hamilim in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, you're not yotzi Shemona Esrei. And yes, it's true that me'ikar adin, you should really be davening again. But unfortunately, the Torah recognized the weakness of the human, and in all probability, if you didn't have kavanah the first time around, you're not going to have it the second time around. And there's no way halacha is going to suggest that you daven again and subject yourself to 19 bracha lebatalos. And therefore, nowadays, we do not go back. There is a fascinating Mishnah Berurah, Shar Tzion, not so commonly known, but a fascinating Shar Tzion, number 18 and 19. The Mechaber says that a person shouldn't hold, and number 17, hold things in their hand while they're davening Shemona Esrei, that would distract them from their ability to have proper kavanah. Mishnah Berurah says that if you did hold things in your hand, if you had kavanah, you don't have to go back and daven. But if you take a look at number 19, the Shar Tzion says, "V'nira li debezeh yachzer af bizmanenu she'im lo yochsom yechavim." Let's say you were holding something in your hand that was distracting while you were davening Shemona Esrei. If you wouldn't have been holding that, you would have had kavanah. You're a person who normally zeroes in on the first bracha Shemon Esrei, and you have kavanah on Perush Hamida. There was an external circumstance of holding something in your hand that distracted you. Or you're a person that normally has kavanah in the first bracha Shemon Esrei, but there were a series of fire trucks that went by in Robertson. As you were starting the first bracha Shemon Esrei, Shua threw you off from your kavanah. The Shar Tzion is paskening, even bisman hazeh, a person would redaven their Shemon Esrei. Because normally you do have kavanah. Normally you would have had kavanah. But the kids started crying in the ladies section, or the fire truck started going by, or you were holding something in your hand that distracted you. So there is a possibility, even bisman hazeh, under certain circumstances, that if one was lacking kavanah of Perush Hamilim in the first bracha Shemon Esrei, that they would go back and daven again. If it was an external reason why you didn't have kavanah. But be it as it may, there's a frightening ber halacha on number 16. The ber halacha is medayik from the Chayei Adam, not important how, but that with the following discussion. Okay, so we said that kavanah of Perush Hamilim is makiv in the first bracha Shemon Esrei. We said if a person's daven Shemon Esrei and realized he didn't have kavanah in the first bracha Shemon Esrei, me'ikar, then he should go back and daven again. We don't, because who says the second time around you'll have kavanah? Beautiful. But then the Mishnah Berurah says, I don't understand. Let's say you're in the middle of davening Shemon Esrei, and you realize in the middle of Shemon Esrei, after Magen Avram, you're in the middle of Atar Gibor, you realize you didn't have kavanah in Avos. What should a person do? You know what happens if you continue davening? Every bracha moving forward is a bracha levatal. Because kavanah in the first bracha Shemon Esrei is absolutely essential for it to qualify as a Shemon Esrei, and you missed it. So what are you going to say? Don't go back, because who says the second time around you're not going to have kavanah? But how do I go forward? I'm stuck in limbo here. Right? If you space out the entire Shemon Esrei, you're better off, because then you look back and okay, what am I supposed to do? But now you realize you clued in the middle of Shemon Esrei, you clued in by Atar Gibor. What in the world are you supposed to do? Continue davening without the kavanah in the first bracha. Everything's a bracha levatal moving forward. Go back. We don't go back nowadays. So the Mishnah Berurah says it's a very difficult predicament that one finds himself. The ber halacha suggests that you should wait for the chazan to begin Chazar Shas, have kavanah to be yod, even though normally one does not discharge his obligation of Shemon Esrei through Chazar Shas. Chazar Shas is only for an Eino Baki. Halacha recognizes situations where a person cannot, on his own daven, because due to a halachic reason, to be considered an Eino Baki, and therefore you could rely on the Chazar Shas. So the ber halacha suggests that a person should wait until the chazan reaches the first bracha, and then have kavanah to be yotzi with that the chazan says, and then continue from the point that you're up to, and moving forward with your silent Shemon Esrei.
Are you now taloi on the chazan's kavanah?
That's an excellent question. Rabbi Yashav, in his Sefer on Brachos, says this ber halacha is a tmiyah, because the same way we don't go back and daven a second time because we probably won't have kavanah, mehechitesi the chazan will have kavanah, especially because of the way in which we treat Chazar Shas. No likely the chazan is not going to have kavanah. So Rabbi Yashav says that he thinks that this suggestion of the ber halacha is a pel. But maybe the ber halacha is relying on, you could rely on chazaka. He's a yid. Halacha dictates he has to have kavanah. It's a cheskes kashrus. So the gabi mi, I have a cheskes kashrus. Maybe that's where the ber halacha is coming from.
Your own kavanah, shemaya kavanah, despite whether he's having kavanah, you can have kavanah in his words.
Okay, so we can give a separate share on that. That's a big sugya of Shrei Koda. But if the person himself that was doing it wasn't yotze, could you be better? Could you be stronger than the weakest link? That's essentially what you're suggesting. To be stronger than the weakest link, that's a separate topic. But be it as it may, that's the ber halacha suggestion. However, the problem is that it's a very serious accusation that the Chavetz Chaim is levying against us. Any one of our Shemona Esreis that don't begin with at least the minimum requirement of Perush Amidim in the first bracha, thus forward is a bracha levatal. So there's going back to that Rav Chaim will save us from this baralach. Rav Chaim was medayik from the Rambam beautifully that the Rambam in Perek Yud does not say a tefillah without kavanah is not a tefillah. The Rambam does not say in Perek Yud that a person should see if he's able to daven before he does so, and if he can't, he cannot daven. Says Rav Chaim, you know why? Because as long as a person is aware of the fact that he's omin lefnei HaMelech when he begins to daven, a lack of kavanah of perush hamilin does not transform your tefillah into not being a tefillah. Rav Chaim says it's not a tefillah b'kavanah, and it could be there's a requirement of tefillah b'kavanah, but it's still a tefillah. As the Mabit said, Shema Koleinu, we ask Hashem, listen to our voice. Our voice means it was just words that were coming out of our mouth, with no intent, with no kavanah perush hamilin. So the Steipler speaks out on his own that it's clear you have to say that even a tefillah below kavanah is a tefillah, and therefore there would not be bracha levatalos moving forward. It happens to be that there's a requirement of tefillah big kavanah, but that doesn't mean that if you daven the tefillah minus kavanah, that it wouldn't be considered a tefillah.
Negative Rambam, or he's
Well, see, in the world of the Rav Chaim's Rambam, this is what Rav Chaim said, right?
Perek Dalet, though.
Because he holds that Perush Hamilim is dealing with Perek Yud. Perek Dalet is Dalet Fnei Atome.
It's like we're saying, no matter what kind of kavanah, or only.
No, so the Mishnah Berurah completely ignores Kavanah Omid Fnei HaMelech. Right? Even though the Mechaber in Sadi Ches says the definition of Kavanah is Perush Hamilim and Omid Fnei HaMelech, Mishnah Berurah completely ignores it when he moves over to Kaf Aleph. And he says clearly that the only kavanah is Perush Hamilim. Right? Why the Mishnah Berurah ignores the second part of the Mechaber? Probably the answer is, if you take a look at the Chazon Ish's attacks on Rav Chaim, part of what the Chazon Ish says is that, come on, there's no way we can expect people to have awareness of Amid Lefnei HaMelech the entire Shemona Esrei. And then the Chazon Ish signs off that sort of like a Chai Adam when it comes to mitzvah strichas kavanah, Chazon Ish signs off, and subconscious kavanah is also kavanah. And if a person's standing up to daven Shemona Esrei, unless he's in a drunkard state, like a shikr savlot, if a person's standing up to daven Shemona Esrei, subconsciously he's there, he's aware that he's omin lefnei HaMelech. So the Chazon Ish agrees to Rav Chaim that there's a requirement of omin lefnei HaMelech. The Chazon Ish just says it's always there. A yid that stands up to daven, what else are you doing? You're in shul, you're davening, tefillah is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Obviously in your heart you're aware that you're omin lefnei HaMelech. So I assume that the Mishnah Berurah agrees to that Chazon Ish, so he doesn't drop the Mechaber's second requirement over the Lefnei HaMelech. He just assumes that unless you're in the state of drunkenness, he assumes that weak subconscious intent of Omer Lefnei HaMelech is sufficient. And that's why when it comes to practical halacha, when he's discussing what's actually required for the person to be cognizant of and focus on, it's only in the context of Perush Hamilim. But that being said, Rav Chaim still taught us a tremendous yesod, that in regards to kavanah Perush Hamilim, a tefillah below kavanah is still a tefillah, it's just lacking the fulfillment of tefillah b'kavanah. And therefore, in regards to the Bar Halacha's question of what does a person do when he finds himself in that predicament, it seems like Rav Chaim would tell you, and the Mabit will tell you, and the Steipler will tell you, continue davening. Shema Koleinu. The tefillah is still a tefillah, you just weren't yotzei tefillah b'kavanah. So if a person is the type of person that always has kavanah, and an external circumstance took him away from it, so then we would tell you go back and daven a second time to have a tefillah b'kavanah. But that doesn't mean that which you were lacking kavanah in your original Shemona Esrei wasn't a tefillah at all. It was a tefillah, it just was a tefillah below kavanah. So at the end of the day, bottom line, it's absolutely essential that at least, at minimum, a person learns through the kavanah of Perush Hamilim in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, and to the best of one's ability, they should ensure that when they stand up to daven Shemona Esrei, they do so with a focus on the Perush HaMilim. This way, all the other brachos that we daven moving forward don't enter into any discussions of being brachos vatalas, and especially going back to the point where David Kunglas observed, especially if a person has a chola that they want to daven for, the Yushalayim Yerchav Racham and Tashav at this time. If you want that to have an effect, if you want that to be impactful, at least let that be in the context of an appropriate Shemona Esrei. And the only way to ensure that those tefillos are in the context of an appropriate Shemona Esrei, a fully halachic qualified Shemona Esrei, is if one at least focuses on the Perush HaMilim when it comes to the bracha of Avos. And any increased kavanah that we have in the first bracha should serve as a tremendous chus for all of Klal Yisrael during these difficult, trying times. Just one last thing. If there's an interest of 2 or 3 people, we could try to pick one day before Shachris in the morning to maybe go through the Shemona Esrei, bracha by bracha, trying to give a perspective on the meaning of the words and the understanding of each of the brachos of Shemona Esrei. So anyone wants to let me know, we try to come up with a day that works, 20 minutes before davening, once a week, starting after Hanukkah, to see if we could go through slowly the Shemona Esrei to try to get a better understanding. And hopefully with our increased kavanah, we would bring about salvation for Klal Yisrael.
And that would be during the week or on Shabbos?
During the week.
If one is in a kahila where almost the only time one can have kavanah is during the silence of Shemona Esrei, everything else is like being on a subway car. It is so disruptive. It takes me 10 minutes just to unwind, and by then the Shemona Esrei is over for the kahila. Is it better for me to daven b'yachid because I had zero kavanah in such an environment? I mean, the thing is, and there's Mishnah Berurah also talks about, it's not just the Shemona Esrei, which is supposed to be quiet. There are sources that talk about even Pesukah Zimra should be quiet. It should be a whisper. And when I hear, for instance, like if I'm in a restaurant and 2 booths away, their conversation is drowning out the conversation I'm having with the person in front of me, it's torture. And so when I hear somebody 20 feet away from me and I hear their words, I can't hear myself think.
I think that I'm not qualified to answer that question.
Who is qualified to answer? Because I need an answer.
Or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if the answer was
40 minutes or something.
that you should not be here.
That I should.
I'm not qualified to answer.
Then
And I'm not answering you.
yeah.
But you should speak to, you should call.
Because if the pinnacle of tefillah is like Chana is considered, and that's like quiet. It doesn't say that she was just doing Shemona Esrei, but just in general. And there's sources in the Mishnah Berurah which talk about, Zohar and Pri Megadim that they say like even Pesukah de Zimra should be quiet.
Those are not, the main question that you have is if you get so worked up because of all the noise that you can't even, from the time you get to transfer, you're not able to.
Yeah.
Should you daven or should you not? That's beyond my pay grade, but that's a legitimate question. The rest of the davening is
Now,
beautiful.
I've even had earplugs, and people are so loud they get through my earplugs.
So the rest of the davening is a plus, but the ikr is the Kabbalah Samach Shemayim Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad,
Okay.
and the first bracha Shemona Esrei.
I wish somebody would like raise a flag, and then I can come in and I'll go someplace else because everything else is just cacophony.
We're gonna chip in and get you better earplugs.
Yeah, you gotta get the noise canceling.
They're not. Okay, the electronic ones for gunfire. I can't use those on Shabbos because again, I can't use them on Shabbos.
Right.
I don't understand the need to be loud, to drown other people's voices out.
Honestly, what is the foundation?